And welcome, everyone, to Austen Mondays. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And for 24 weeks, we're going on a biblio-venture with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In each episode, I talk with a special guest, a brilliant Austen scholar, creator, or Janeite about Austen and her works. And then I have an hour-long conversational annotation with a chapter co-host in which we illuminate, elucidate, and explicate a few chapters of Pride and Prejudice. And our special guest today for our turnabout the room is Stephanie Barron. Welcome.
Thank you, Edward. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, good. It's wonderful to have you on the show. I know we have plenty of people in our audience who have read your books and are really excited to hear from you. So thank you. Good. All righty. Well, more with Stephanie in a moment. Stay tuned for our chapter annotation segment when Dr. Lauren Nixon will join me to talk about chapters 39 to 41 or volume 2, chapters 16 to 18, if that is the way your edition is chapterized. And we're calling it Lydia Takes Charge of the Bennets. And because that's what happens in these chapters, I think, Stephanie. Like
Lydia runs amok. Yeah,
she does. She suddenly becomes a much more significant character in this run of chapters. Anyway, it is if you're watching live on YouTube right now, or you're watching the recording of this, I invite you to please like the video and also subscribe to the Rosenbach channel. Doing that gives our show greater visibility and leads to more people discovering Austen Mondays. But now let's take a turn about the room. Stephanie Barron, who also writes as Francine Matthews, is the author of 30 novels of suspense, espionage, and historical fiction, including the Jane Austen Mystery Series. A graduate of Princeton, Barron received an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Fellowship in the Humanities and earned a master's in history from Stanford University. Stephanie also worked as a journalist and as an intelligence analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency, where she briefly served on the investigation into the bombing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. Stephanie, I have to do that whole intro because it is just what a fascinating life you have had. I am so happy to have you on the show today.
I'm sure Jane would have had as interesting CV had she lived 200 years later.
Yeah, had she been able to do
right.
It, you know. So your Jane Austen mystery series is now at, is it 14 books with one coming out this year?
Yeah, I actually have been working on number 15 today as we speak. I am in revision hell, Edward.
Well, thank you for taking the time. While
you're no, it's actually a welcome relief. Believe
good.
me.
I hope this is a friendly respite. So.
Yeah, I have my glass of wine here because
good.
We're talking now, which is fun. So yeah, I wrote 14 novels in the series, and the most recent one was called Jane and the Year Without a Summer, and it came out in February.
Right here, there it is. I love it.
Oh yeah, great cover. It came out almost a year ago, and it features 1816, which was this year that Jane began to start feeling ill, and I have been writing in recent months about her death, or not actually about her death, but about her final months of life in 1817, which is how the series is going to wrap up. And it's been bittersweet because since about book 13, I've been well aware that Jane has limited time, but while inhabiting her as a character, I'm equally aware that she has no idea about that up until the book that you just showed, in which she starts to realize that she is actually declining. So it's been an interesting journey for me because I started writing about her when she was 26 in 1802, and I've gotten her to 41 and a half, and it's been quite a part of my life. So
it's 1 year of her life, every book then. Is that, I mean?
Yeah, it actually has been.
Yeah.
It totally has been. Although it's taken me about 28 years to write those 15 years of her life.
I always ask a question of the people and take a turn about the room, in that, did you have an Austen discovery moment in your life?
I've had myriad Austen discovery moments. I would have to say, I think that some of them have occurred when I've made connections that I didn't expect. in reading her letters or reading about people she knew. Simple example is the Comte, who went through Henry and his wife, and out to have been a spy, French nobleman who spied for both Russia.
I missed a piece of that. We had a little glitch there.
I apologize.
That's okay.
Where did you lose me?
Who the people were? I missed the names.
Sorry. So the Comte d'Entraigues was a French spy. He also was spying for the Russians while living in London. He was married to a former French opera singer. They were good friends of Henry and Eliza's in London, and Jane met them at a musical evening at Eliza's house, and then again went to their home in outside of London in Barnet.
This is Jane's brother Henry and his wife.
Yes, yeah. And a year after she met them, they were both murdered in their beds, potentially by a servant, but I think probably because they were spies. And so I think because I have a background in espionage, when I find these kinds of connections and I see Jane Austen knew these people, Henry and Eliza had them in their home, and then they're murdered and they're revealed as having been spies of both France and Russia while in London. It's just one of those wonderful moments where you see Jane as having a larger life than is often portrayed. So yeah, I mean, I find almost with every book I've written, I have a Jane Austen moment where I'm stunned by something I discover. In the book you held up, the most recent one, I think because I am a woman of a certain age, I was thinking about how odd it was that Jane Austen first evidenced signs of what may have been Addison's disease, which is an adrenal autoimmune disease at 40. And I thought, what is it about being 40? She didn't show it at any other time in her life. And normally Addison's presents earlier in one's life. And I started just on a whim researching Addison's in menopause and discovered a study from NIH that I think was 2003 that showed a 300% more likelihood incidence of Addison's in women who had early onset menopause. Jane suddenly, and early onset menopause is defined as 40 or younger. So suddenly at age 40, Jane is starting to have symptoms of Addison's and she's dead within a year and a half. That's a really interesting coincidence. And of course, it's something I'll never be able to prove, but that was one of those aha moments I've had with Austen, where something in my life coincides with something in hers. And it's kind of a singular moment, I think, for me as a writer.
And you explore, first describe your series for anybody out there who hasn't read them yet. I mean, it's Jane is a sleuth, right? I mean, that's right. That's a nutshell, but.
Right. Which I think originally was a bit off-putting to some readers, Edward, but the first book came out in 1996, I think, and sprang from my desire as a mystery author. I had already been published in my contemporary series at that point, to use Jane Austen's incredibly rich language, which I cherish, as I imagine every reader of Austen does, for its complexity, and particularly with dialogue, its ability to convey multiple meanings in a single line. And we can talk about that if you want, particularly about Pride and Prejudice.
Please do.
Yeah, but I wanted to use the language in a way that a modern reader would kind of submit to without feeling oppressed by that 200-year-old diction. And so I felt that if I gave them a sense of jeopardy, a mystery plot, a puzzle to solve, and gave them Jane as their guide through that plot, that they might submit to her language and her world without really feeling burdened by it. Some people do, some readers do when they're new to Austen. The other reason I chose to make her a detective is because I feel as though Jane endures for all of us as an incredibly important member of the English canon because of her unique ability to convey the motivations of the human heart, that she understands human motivation almost better than anybody other than perhaps Shakespeare. And that to me is the essence of being a detective. If you can understand and penetrate, which is a very Austenian word, if you can penetrate the motivations of others, their compulsions, you get to the core of what makes them operate as humans.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the essential of all of her examinations of relationships between men and women. Her women in particular are on investigations, their entire lives of the men around them who have the power to determine their happiness, their futures, their station in life. And, you know, you see that within Eliza Bennet or Lydia, to go to your example. They have this very limited knowledge of the men in their sphere that's entirely derived from public encounters. And based on that limited, masked sort of knowledge, they end up having to make decisions that determine their happiness. And it's a real crapshoot. And I think Jane was adept at showing us that, whether you see someone who's, you know, reduced by an encounter with a Willoughby to being an unwed pregnant woman, or, you know, Wickham, who's just destructive everywhere he goes. So I love that about Jane, that she would present us with characters who demanded investigation, particularly by her female characters, but by the readers. And in placing her in detective novel scenarios, I am giving her that role in a very explicit way, but one that I think plays to her strengths.
Yeah.
So the series began when she was 26 in 1802 and had just refused the marriage proposal of Harris Bigwither, who was the younger brother of her good friends, the Big sisters, Catherine, Althea, and Elizabeth Big.
A family the Austens knew well and were staying with. They were very friendly with the sisters.
Yes, and Harris was going to inherit Manydown House, which was a wonderful property in Hampshire, in the neighborhood of Steventon, where Jane had grown up. Interestingly, I mention this because I come full circle in the final book. Another aha moment, to go to your point earlier, researching this book, which is set in Winchester in May of 1817. I hadn't actually focused on the fact that Jane ends up in Winchester because of one of the Big sisters. Elizabeth Big Heathcote, is living in the close at the cathedral in Winchester. And it's she who finds Jane's final doctor, Mr. Lyford, the surgeon, and who rents her lodgings in Winchester, where Jane and Cassandra go for her treatment. And I found it interesting that kind of early arc of when I chose to position Jane after she refuses Harris, Elizabeth's brother, ends with Jane in Winchester because of Elizabeth. And, you know, that it's that final care of friendship that closes sort of the series and Jane's life.
Mm-hmm. And you bring this historical detail for life and all. So, I mean, what I love so much about your books is that they are just as much interesting, fascinating mystery stories, which I also really like to read, but also historical fiction. And that I mean, there are some historical fiction authors who I think I learn more history from than I do from historians. But that's your background too, because
Yes.
you're studying it.
So at Princeton, I actually majored in European history, but I focused in my thesis. As an undergrad at Princeton, you're required to write a thesis, and it's a year-long endeavor. And my thesis, in fact, was 150 pages long. And I focused on Napoleonic France. I was fascinated with Napoleonic military history, which I think derived from my early exposure to War and Peace. I ended up reading War and Peace as an adolescent because I was really compelled by that period in history, and only later understood that it was also the same period as the Regency in England and Jane Austen was writing about. And, you know, there are these moments as an adolescent, I was 12 at the time, where you put together connections that you don't realize are there. That War and Peace on one side of the globe was the same roughly period as Pride and Prejudice on the other. And I found that absolutely fascinating as a kid. And it dictated what I was interested in college. So I ended up, writing about the Napoleonic Wars, and the corollary obviously is the Regency in England. So I wanted to use that as a basis for a historical series. And when I started writing the Janes in 1994, they came out in 96. Nobody was writing about the Regency in detective fiction, much less, in historical fiction. They were writing about Regency in romantic terms, in the romance field. So I loved being able to bring the military history into the Jane Austen series. Her two brothers, Frank and Charles, who were captains in the Royal Navy, are perfect vehicles for that.
Yeah.
But you also find in the letters constant references by Jane to Cassandra about contemporary events that were military or political in nature, that kind of go unnoticed or under the radar for readers of the letters not as well versed in that history. So they're a rich source for me for placing the books in the context of the greater history of Britain at the time, which I find utterly compelling. And the fact that she had her brother Henry as a banker who was plugged into and subject to the economics of warfare and the upheaval of the time, also dovetails really nicely. So it's been able to afford me a lot of richness of context for the books, not just from her life, but from her period that I love bringing to the fore, because I think she's grossly neglected because of Henry's posthumous characterization of her as this quiet spinster who was religious and lived in the country and was devoted to her family. But she was also having evenings out with Russian spies in London when she was staying with them, so you have to kind of get that complexity back into the books, I think.
Good. I like that. I like that strain that's been happening in the Austen biographies as well, that we've been seeing more of recently.
Yeah.
The you also have this fascinating way of, because you're taking these kind of years in her life, it's like we have just enough we know just enough about Austen and the records and the letters that are remaining for there to be biographies, but there's so many blanks. And I love that your books, they're kind of like they're filling in the blank in a fictional way, like but you also deal with other issues in her life that clearly she's, that are affecting her, and that happens. So people could do a
great gift of fiction
novels, as knowing that they're fiction, but people could do worse reading them and getting a lot of biography out of them.
It's interesting. I occasionally have served as a traveling lecturer for JASNA, the Jane Austen Society of North America, and I'll visit chapters and talk, and people will sometimes say to me, why you love the research, which of course is true. I've always said, whether I'm writing a spy novel or a women's fiction or Jane, the research is what gets me interested in stories. I write to be able to do the research. But, someone has said to me in an audience, why aren't you writing real history? And I always find that amusing because my answer is simple. People love to be entertained, and they will learn as the result of being entertained and engaged. And so I have discovered over the years that I really have brought people who never heard Jane Austen's name, who have said to me, this Jane you write about, she actually lived, to suddenly being alive to her period, alive to her time, alive to her voice, which I do my best to capture. And I never feel better than when someone says to me, because I read your books, I went and read Pride and Prejudice. Not I went and watched Pride and Prejudice, but I went and read Pride and Prejudice. So I feel like I've actually done a service to Jane and to history by writing fiction.
Great. You mentioned earlier about the Austen's prose and how she writes and the
Mhm.
depth of it, and you are, of course, and because it's their first person Jane, you have to write as she wrote. I mean, obviously that's very, that's daring to think that, okay, I can write like Jane Austen, but and you do it brilliantly. But what did you learn, especially early on in trying to, was it a matter of you understood more about writing and creating characters by having to, not just writing a novel on your own, but actually trying to do the same prose style?
Throw my voice. No, here's the nasty little secret. I am a born mimic.
Mm-hmm.
And I have this terrible tendency, if I'm in the company of someone who speaks with an accent, to adopt their accent. I mean, it's unconscious, but embarrassing. And so I actually was pregnant with my elder son in 1994. And I found it a hallucinatory state. I was constantly, out of body, out of mind. And I was hearing voices, definitely. And one of them was Jane's. I had been reading her work, as I do often in the winter. I find her books conducive to being read in winter. And I started talking in Austenese, as I call it, just in conversation. My husband would say, "What did you do today? How were you today?" And I'd say, "Well, it being evident the weather should continue fine, we determined upon a pleasure party to the lake." And I'd catch myself doing this kind of thing. And I thought, oh God, I've got to use this voice somehow. I've got to get it out of my head. And so that's when I sat down and wrote the first Jane. Mm-hmm. So I find it effortless to write in Janese. But I distinguish between two types, and you put your finger on it. The books are first-person narratives. So they are very much the voice of her letters, mm-hmm. which is far less edited, less passive voiced than her narrative fiction. Viciously funny, intimate, unsparing, but also remarkably efficient in the way that she could summarize something quickly and brutally. That's one of the things I love about her. She, I think, knew quite well that she had this immense power verbally to subject people that she encountered to her opinion, to her swift disposal intellectually of their foibles and their failings and their gifts. And that was her superpower, was her verbal acuity. And it comes through in the letters, but in certainly her prose, it's much more massaged. It is contained. It is reworked. And something like Pride and Prejudice, it's a narrative that she massaged for years. And so I try in the book to contrast between her letters or her journal entries where she's writing or speaking intimately to someone she knew well, and passages that are narrative in nature that attempt to capture the spirit of her novels, that have that more omniscient third person impact for the reader when she's describing scenery or an interior of a home or something that gives you, or a political situation, or her analysis of a murder investigation, that gives you that authorial voice that's so commanding in her novels. So I feel like there are two prose styles going on in the novels, and they are consciously deployed on my part to either give the reader a sense of intimacy or of authority.
Do you find that your background as an intelligence analyst also helps you kind of, make these kinds of observations and notice these differences in writing?
I think it's a chicken and egg question.
Okay.
Because I was an analyst, because I am a high analytic cognitively. Mm-hmm. So I was born that way. That's how I am wired. I'm somebody who can take disparate pieces of information and render them into a coherent and complex whole. And I do that writing, but I tend to start I tend to invert that process. So I start with the whole because I have a story arc in my mind, and I have to then disassemble it and leave clues for the readers, and a structure that's kind of decomposed, and the reader is assembling it as they read. But it's one that I already organically have in my head. So it's a fascinating process. I often start with the ending of a book, because I feel that if you get in a car, you need to know your destination. You don't need to know your whole route. But when I plot a book, I need to know the destination, which is the ending. When you know why someone would have killed someone else, which is a major act and decision that most of us will never take in our lifetimes. When you know why someone would end another person's life, you know a great deal about that person and their victim. And then you know something about their relationship, whether it was one based on hatred or love or indifference and exploitation. You know something about those two people. And then you can work backwards in rings concentrically, like a pond rippling, to the beginning of the book, where nothing about that ending, that kernel, is known. You're way out here, and you're gradually working your way back in to the ending, which is the resolution of the whole conflict. So that's a little bit about writing process, and I hope it doesn't sound too vague, but it's
it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's how I plot a novel, and I think, in intelligence work, you're given pieces of information every day, and you are trying to use them, to get a nuanced and complex picture of a whole. In something like Panem 103, I found it fascinating. About a month ago, they found the bomb maker, or indicted the bomb maker from that terrorist event. And that was something that occurred in 1988. So it's a very long time ago. And I remember that they found the timer of the bomb, which was something the size of my fingernail, little fingernail, that was located in 3,600 square miles of terrain in Scotland by the Scottish police. They found that timer. And that timer was one of 12 made by a Swiss timer maker. And from that, they could trace it to the bomb maker. It's these tiny little facts that you assemble into a coherent whole. And you don't have all the pieces of information at the same time or in the same place. So it's a cumulative process. And to me, that's kind of what it's like to read a mystery novel.
Yeah, that's what I was going to respond, that's a mystery, not reading a mystery in a nutshell. So
yeah.
Well, we had one question here, so let me ask you before we go then, from Cassandra, wants to know about the inspiration for the Lord Harold Trowbridge character. And which one is this in?
Oh, he is in multiple novels.
Okay.
Lord Harold is a composite of several Whig noblemen. The Whig Party was the equivalent, I guess, of the Democratic Party, you could say today, here in the US, or possibly not really the Labour Party in England now, but at any rate, the Whigs. So the Whig politicians were opposed to the Crown, which was backed by the Tory party. One thing I love to do is read memoirs of people and letters who collected letters of people who lived and moved in English society at the time. Someone like Lord Holland, who kind of ran the Whig Party for a long time. His nephew was Charles James Fox, who was a famous Whig politician. The younger sons of such families that were highly political and opposed to the crown produced people like Lord Harold, and they're riddled throughout the memoirs of famous Whig politicians that I've collected and read. So he's really a composite of people like that. But I made him someone who is vital to intelligence, because he had informal power. He was the second son. He was wealthy. He could move freely. He was very cultured. He was very well educated. a lot of qualities that made him an ideal vehicle for that kind of intrigue and influence, but also someone who's just a social figure, and that's how he encounters Jane.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to reading the next book, the final book in the series. When are we expecting this, or do we know yet?
November, probably early November, late October of this year.
In
It's
time for
actually
Christmas?
changed. I had a working title, but it's now changed. It's being called Jane and the Final Mystery, which is kind of a nod to the series ending, but also a nod to death being the final mystery. So that's where we are.
Well, this has been a pleasure. I can't wait to read. And it's been some years since I'd read and discovered your books, and now I'm kind of jumping right back into them again from the start, and I'm just
Right.
loving this. So thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you for
Well,
writing.
I really enjoyed talking with you, Edward, and it's such a great program, and I love all of the discourse on Pride and Prejudice, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about Lydia.
We can watch that on YouTube, and thank you so much for taking a turn about the room with us today. It has been a pleasure. And
Yeah.
take care, Stephanie. I hope to see you again.
Thank you. Okay,
Alrighty.
take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, everyone, next week, our Turnabout the Room guest will be Collins Hemingway, author of a historical fiction based on the life of Jane Austen. So we get another author in here 2 weeks in a row. I love that. Coming soon, we have some other great guests on for Turnabout the Room. Dr. Alexander L. Ames, from the curator from the Rosenbach, will be here on January 30th to talk about tea drinking and the tea ceremony in the Regency. And Dr. Clara Toot will be here on February 6th. Let me take this moment to thank all of you for watching this episode. As a nonprofit organization, the Rosenbach Museum and Library depends on the generosity of friends and supporters like you to keep programs like this free and accessible to hundreds of fellow Austen lovers worldwide. If you'd like to donate to the Rosenbach, you can do so at our website. You could also become a member. Membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to members-only events. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website. And at the end of the show, I give a shout out to those who have donated since our last show. I'll do that today. Lots of great in-person and virtual programs and courses coming up. The Rosenbach, you can go to our website to see those, including a really fascinating virtual course that's starting this next week on William Butler Yeats. And then an in-person course, if you live in the Philadelphia area, on Robert Burns, which will start in February. I'm looking forward to those courses myself. Austen Mondays merchandise is still available. We have a few things left. There's a few t-shirts left, some stickers and buttons. Visit the Rosenbach's website to buy. And for today's chapter annotation segment, I want to welcome back my co-host, Dr. Lauren Nixon. Lauren.
Hi, hello.
It is good to see you. We have a new setting for you here. Okay, I'm used to Mervyn Peake behind you.
Mervyn Peake, yeah, he's in storage temporarily. This is my childhood bedroom, currently repurposed as an office.
Oh,
while I transition.
Is that good or bad? Are you like, oh, this is
it's a bit strange, I won't lie. Yes, imagine. But yeah, unfortunately, Mervyn scares my mum, so he's living in storage until I have a new office. Right. He is quite intimidating, but he's soft at heart, really.
All right. If people don't know what we're talking about, you need to watch all your episodes of Lauren's on. You'll see him in his portrait as peeking over her shoulder there. Well, right now, let me share before we get talking. Let me remind everybody that every week I enjoy an Austen-themed cocktail and drinking with Jane and Ed. Today I'm drinking one called the Lydia Bennet. This is, I have to actually fix myself some more because I just drank the whole one for a segment. So
I imagine a Lydia Bennet has to be quite drinkable.
Well, yes, and it's basically an amaretto sour that I've added a little maple syrup to as well, and it is, as I wrote in the description, amaretto is a sweet nutty liqueur, usually too cloying on its own, but very adaptable in a cocktail. And I feel like, well, I could take Lydia. Well, I'd have a hard time taking Lydia on her own. In a mix with the rest of the Bennet sisters, she is perfect.
Yes, she's probably a delight in mixed company.
No, and the maple syrup is a little extra zest because so is Lydia. And if you want a mocktail, just replace the amaretto and the bourbon with little pineapple juice, and then also put a little juice from the maraschino jar in as well. That helps kind of replicate I don't know. I always say for a mocktail, but you know what? I have no idea, because
I should really start testing them out and actually like
you could be my mocktail expert, because I don't know what it's like.
Should I be the mocktail mixologist?
I don't know what it is to not have alcohol in a drink. So, but this is very tasty, and it's tastier the more I drink it. So it's one of those drinks. All righty. Well, for today, we are going to talk about, here we are, chapters 39 to 41. Lydia takes charge of the Bennets. And in these chapters, well, it's also volume 2, chapter 16 to 18, if you have that edition. But before we talk about Lydia and everybody, I mean, it's Elizabeth and Jane and all through here. But since last you were on the show, Lauren, Darcy proposed, and it was terrible.
The worst proposal in literary history.
And then Elizabeth read his long letter. And so first, there's your first thought on the proposal, worst in history. Is it worse than Mr. Collins's proposal? And a little bit on, Elizabeth's revelations, like she say the first time I see myself, or
she has her humbling moment.
Yeah. So
I have very specific feelings about that first proposal. I think I've mentioned this before. I think because I have no issue with the Austen tourism industry. It's very much how I got here. I've, have a real love and nostalgia for it. But also, as films like Austen Land point out, it is quite ridiculous sometimes.
We just watched it the other night, my wife.
Oh, it's so funny, good. And JJ feels fantastic in it. But one of the things that used to really get me was that we would sell mugs, notepads, magnets, any pens, anything you could think of, diaries with Colin Firth's face on. Fair enough, totally understood that. But not with the quote from later, but with the quote from the first proposal. And I used to think, like, we've basically just put someone's like horny Instagram DM on a notepad, and we're selling it as romantic. And I was like, what he says later is so beautiful, and it's one of like Austen's best written speeches. You're not supposed to find it romantic in that moment. But they also put a very ill-advised quote on the £5 note, so what can you say? But yeah, that, I think I always find that have like a weird like PTSD about that specific proposal.
It's like the quotes from the quote about preferring a book to anything that you see on things, but it's actually Marilyn Bingley who doesn't mean it at all. So
and who could ever be tired of Bath? It's like, it's satire, guys. It's sarcasm, please. But I hate that proposal in the way that I think are supposed to, and the way that she kind of savages him afterwards, but then is herself humbled. It's a really great moment because they both need to be kind of brought down a peg, to put it simply. And I do really kind of love how that happens, because we've all been there. Like, I think especially those of us that, you know, were the brightest in our 300 person school, and then we went to a, you know, 3,000 person college, or, you know, a 10,000 person university, and all of a sudden everybody's as smart and as intelligent and as witty as you are, and you have that kind of moment where you're like, oh, I've made a mistake, or my judgments aren't fully right, I'm experiencing more of the world, and there's possibilities. You know, Lizzie's probably not someone who would think that the stuff that Wickham has done necessarily does happen, or if she thinks it happens, she probably thinks it's, you know, it takes two to tango, and actually what he's done is, you know, take advantage of a child. And I think, yeah, it's a really great moment for Lizzie as a character and for the intended reader. I think it's why this novel is so pervasive. We all have that moment, I think, that we can go, oh yeah, I've been there, I understand that. And I really love the trajectory that Lizzie goes on from this point on. And for those of you that are reading for the first time, for me, these chapters kind of post return to Meryton, Jane and Lizzie being reunited, I think this is where the Bildungsroman element of the novel starts to happen. And I see a lot of parallels with Gothic fiction here. You know, in the Gothic, you go through the terror experience, you're forced to see the crime happen in person. And I actually think that what Austen's doing here is mimicking that Gothic experience in real life, you know, like in Northanger Abbey, reminding you that just because the devilish Marquis is not going to, you know, kidnap his niece and lock her up for a fortune and potentially take her virtue, people are still going to do bad things to each other for money, power, sex. And Lizzie has that same experience that the Gothic heroine has. And I love that transition in terms of literature from sensibility to the Gothic to, you know, the 19th century realism that Austen kind of kicks off right at the beginning of the century.
Well, let's look at some of that, this experience that she's gone through now, her reflection of it. Before we get there though, she is, it's chapter 39. It was the second week in May, in which three young ladies set out together from Grace Church Street for the town of in Hertfordshire, and they're at Elizabeth and Mariah go, and I'd forgotten about Mariah, and I'll mention that again later.
Everybody forgets about Mariah.
No, she doesn't get a mention here, and I was like, what? But it's all part of, I think, what happens here, in that Lydia dominates everything, and of course you get Elizabeth talking, you know, sometimes, or maybe a comment from someone else, but it's all about Lydia when they get there, and because they've just gone to pick up Jane from the gardeners, and now they're heading, and they've stopped at this inn, and there's Kitty and Lydia looking out of the dining room upstairs, I'm sure shouting, happily employed. Oh, they had been happily employed in visiting a milliner, to, you know, a hat store to get some hats and ribbons and clothing, watching the sentinel on guard, and dressing a salad and cucumber. Which is, and then when the sisters come in, it says they triumphantly displayed a table set out with such cold meat as an inn larder usually affords, exclaiming, "Is not this nice? Is not this an agreeable surprise? And we mean to treat you all," added Lydia, "but you must lend us the money, for we have just spent ours at the shop." What a treat.
It's such a it's such a playing grown-up moment that reminds you how much these are teenage girls. And this is one of those things, you know, like you were just talking about, you know, your Austen discovery moments, and that you find things out when you come back to them. And I don't think it was until, you know, I was in my late 20s that I looked back at these moments and was like, oh my God, these are children. These are teenage girls. Like, I remember, you know, having my 15-pound wage from my Sunday job and going into town on a Saturday and thinking, I'm so grown up, you know, I'm going to go shopping. And, you know, it was barely enough money to see me through the day, even, you know, 15 years ago. But you had that thing, you went out and you were being really grown up, and you hang out and you buy yourself things with your money. And I remember, like, we would go to Pizza Hut, like 7 of us, and get the deal that was meant to be for 2 people and split it between like these multiple teenagers. But it just reminds you that this is behavior, that these are teenage girls, very real, very tangible teenage girls. Where else in classic literary canon do you get such a honest, genuine, and funny but not really judgmental rendition of teenage girls? You know, oh, we've come to meet you, we're so grown up, we've made the salad, we've done all this, but we've got no money, we've behaved inappropriately, and actually we need you to save the day.
I can remember when I was happened to me too, when I was 17. I remember I worked at McDonald's when I was a teenager, which my children thought this was the greatest thing in the world. Well, I think so. And this is an actual conversation. One of them had said to her one time, like, oh, my dad like flies planes or something like that. We used to fly planes. And one of my kids actually said, my dad used to work at McDonald's. Like, that was a big deal. I mean, and I got fired too. That's how bad I was. But when I got fired, I got fired on payday, and I took my check and I went to the record store and bought the entire Springsteen catalog in one shot. My final check. That's all. That was, what else do I need in life? I don't have a job. I don't need anything else. I just need these records. So Lydia needs a bonnet, and she says that she says, I bought a bonnet, but I shall pull it to pieces as soon as I get home and see if I can make it up any better. And here's a little discovery moment for me, because what at first seems to me to be something that, like, it's really frivolous about her, and that's also there. This is how the kind of person she is. She just buys the pull apart. She's only concerned with how it's going to look in the end. But it's also an interesting way of, this is who she is as a character. She is the kind of person that takes charge of the things that she is given in her life to make it better for herself. You know, the sisters right away are like, when she asks them about it, they all abused it as ugly. Like, it's an ugly bonnet anyway. Well, you better make it better, I guess they're saying. And I think it's fascinating because in a sense, it's Lydia understands, and she doesn't go about it the right way, I don't think, in this world that she's in, but she does understand that she's got to take what she wants and fix it herself, or she's not going to have anything.
Yeah. Austen does this, and I think this is something that is very much under the surface and that you don't get until you start to really look. There are a lot of young women of ruined potential in these novels, particularly Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, but also, you know, Mansfield Park, and even Emma. Like, no one is really ruined necessarily in Emma, but Harriet is the product of someone's ruin, we assume, because she is an illegitimate child. So you see it off screen, off page in Sense and Sensibility. It almost happens to Marianne. But then in Pride and Prejudice, we see it kind of, you know, we don't get the end of Lydia's story. And I think this is why so many people have been fascinated by retelling and continuing Lydia's story. But this is a girl of 15, 16 years old who is developing a real keen understanding of how to make their way in the world. This is a society that's very image focused. These are gentlemen's daughters. Their father has a carriage that he can send to town for his daughters. They have enough, you know, status, money, and grace to be able to do things like go and stay with relatives in London, take trips, you know, be somewhat educated. Then they're not fantastically wealthy, they're not fantastically highbrow, but there's this kind of notion here where if Lydia was put into the right care, say, you know, an aunt who, you know, like Aunt March, if there was an Aunt March in this situation who could take her to London, dress her in the right clothes, Lydia could probably charm somebody of a much higher status, much higher, you know, income, and really do well for herself. But because she has been spoiled, because she only has her mother for education, because she's in this very insular society, this potential kind of goes to waste. And it's all kind of played out as a big joke, but it's also sad and scary. And there's a reason why there's this tension and this anxiety in these chapters when they start to talk about Brighton.
I want to revisit that later because I have some things, but it's really tied to, you know, what Elizabeth says to her father about Lydia. So that's something I definitely want to revisit later about Lydia's character and whether she could change. But you're brilliant. I love talking to you.
Thank you for inflating my ego.
Oh, you're so wonderful. I could just not talk at all when you're on the show. So, and as it's with Kathleen and Casey as well. Clearly, I'm not singling you out.
They are brilliant.
You're all Lizzies. Elizabeth. Well, Lydia tells him that the militia is leaving. Elizabeth's happy about that. She knows things now, and just the way and then I love this that they tell the waiter. The waiter was told that he need not stay. They want him out of the room, or Jane and Elizabeth want him out of the room before he hears what's going on. I mean, this idea that Lydia doesn't even care what the servants will hear, but and he's not even, I mean, he's like an innkeeper who is going to encounter everybody and collect gossip, right?
Well, it's that kind of reminder again that Jane and Lizzie have some sense that is not necessarily the product of either parent, but just a better understanding. And we get that impression that they had a better education than the younger sisters because they're slightly older. By the time they get to Lydia, they're like, who cares? But Mrs. Bennet does this throughout. Yeah. She is constantly running her mouth in front of servants, and the girls are like, oh my God, please stop talking. Not because it's mortifying, but because they're like, well, that's it now. The story is out of the bag. Like, everybody is going to know because that servant will tell that servant who tell that servant. And I know Kathleen talks about this with so much more eloquently than I can because that's her speciality. But, the cringe moment is that she talks about stuff in front of servants, and Jane and Elizabeth straight away are like, as soon as Lydia says what she says, they're like, get out. Like, this innkeeper needs to go. And they literally do that thing where, she's like, oh, I've got news for you. They exchange a glance and they're like, can you go, please? Can you leave? And I think it just is one of those little moments where, I've talked about this before, but Austen does that thing where she's very critical of society, but then she's also like, some rules exist for a reason. Just because I don't agree with it doesn't mean that just completely disregarding it is a good thing. There's a balance between reputation and reason, X, Y, and Z. But I just love that they just look at each other and they're like, oh, here we go. We know what's coming.
Well, what they find out. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, you remember that Lydia has been without her older sisters now for a number of weeks. And it's almost as if they're like, yes, you've been on your own with a town full of militiamen and no supervision, and you've gotten even worse in that time.
And she's got a lot to tell them, which is that Wickham is not marrying Miss King, that he is, as she says, safe, meaning safe for marrying one of them, perhaps. And I think she's pointing this to Elizabeth because she understands, as everyone else does, that Elizabeth and Wickham were flirting with each other. Elizabeth thinks like, oh, well, that's good for Mary King. I like that Jane is, we get the reaction that Jane is concerned for their feelings. I hope there's no strong attachment on either side, said Jane. Like, she's just worrying that, there's somebody's going to be hurt. And Lydia is just, well, her impression is that it's bad for Miss King if she liked him. That's not a good, but Wickham didn't like her anyway because she's she's got freckles and
a nasty little freckled thing.
Lydia's not kind at all about it. And then there's this fascinating little paragraph here. Read that. Elizabeth was shocked to think that. Read that little paragraph.
Elizabeth was shocked to think that, however incapable of coarseness of such coarseness of expression herself, the coarseness of the sentiment was little other than her own breast had formerly harbored and fancied liberal.
So this and nobody reading this thinks, oh, Elizabeth, you're just like Lydia. But Elizabeth can see that in herself, that we had this in previous chapters where she talked, and this was after the letter. So this was the last time we talked about chapters. When she read Darcy's letter, she realized how it was her vanity that led her to, think, ill of, or not ill of, but that it was her vanity that let her enjoy the talk from the attention from Wickham, and to say, yeah, that Miss King, she's got nothing. So.
She ain't shit.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, isn't it? Like, this is a family, and yes, family members can be very different. But I think one of the things that Austen does, and is so interested in Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, is how siblings in particular can be so similar and so different, which is obviously something that she's explored so much, not only between herself and Cassandra, and there's a lot of reflection with Jane and Elizabeth, but with her brothers too. They all have these very unique relationships that you see come through in the letters, that it's that moment of like, oh, I judge myself by Lydia. Elizabeth's almost like, oh, I judge Lydia so harshly that I think I can't possibly be like her. But actually, I have the same vanity, I have the same arrogance, and it is that sort of bringing it back down to earth moment. But also, I think this isn't one of the novels where Austen is very interested in things like nature versus nurture. Obviously, that is an emerging concept at this point, but this is very much a text that is interested in how people are raised and how people are socialized, and how that then influences their behavior and their desires as adults, and their ability to convey that. And I love these little asides that are in Austen's authorial voice about Elizabeth, because it has that extra layer to it, because it's not Elizabeth's thought narration necessarily, it's kind of that Austen interjection. And you wonder sort of like how much of her own self she's putting in there.
They all pack up into the coach, all their boxes, work bags, parcels, the unwelcome addition of Kitty's and Lydia's purchases. Lydia thinks this is hilarious. They're all crammed in. We're gonna have so much fun. We'll talk and laugh all the way home. Well, Lydia does talk the whole way home. Kitty's just the sidekick here. This is a real, instance here of how Kitty just doesn't really get. I mean, she's older, but she's just the sidekick to Lydia and everything that she talks about. Lydia's I would be ashamed of not being married before 3 and 20. She's saying to Jane, who's just lost the person that she wanted, and then she wants to be married before any of you. I would like to I will chaperone about you to all the balls. I mean, put a pin in that, everybody, for later in the novel. But she also mentions that her and Mrs. Forster, the Colonel's wife, have become such friends. Which will come into play later. And then they tell this odd story, right? We dressed with the soldiers, and they were all getting together, and we dressed up Chamberlain, who I'm assuming is one of the officers in the militia, in women's clothes on purpose to pass for a lady. And they have this, and then some of the officers come in and they don't know it's him at first, and oh, what fun. Yeah, that's a weird little trick.
This little story.
Your cross-dressing soldier game is a favorite of mine.
Well, there's so many things for me, obviously, this weird little soldier moment, and the existence of Mrs. Forster in this novel as it is. She is barely any older than Lydia. This is the wife of a man that's supposed to be a respected army officer, and he's, essentially been victim of a gold digger. Which, more power to Mrs. Forster. But you instantly, when you start to you kind of pass it by. This is not something I noticed about Pride and Prejudice. Even when I was writing, my thesis chapter on Pride and Prejudice, it was all about Wickham. I was like, yeah, Wickham, that's obviously the officer focus. I'm going to talk about Wickham and, the misuse of the officer as like a play pretend. And then as I started rereading it, I was like, wait a minute, there's so much in this. the fact that you have got not only the colonel's wife, but the local young ladies, most of whom we assume, including the wife, are under 20, dressing up one of the officers for the entertainment and amusement of the others. So for one thing, where are all the private soldiers? Because they're officers, they will have men under their command. It's not just a regiment of officers. There's private soldiers here somewhere. But also that this is kind of recalling things like Coxheath Camp, which was when like the Duke of Devonshire paraded around when they were in the militia, and Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, you know, went and dressed herself up and they were performing masks and all sorts, and it was this big salacious party. She's almost kind of referencing this on a much smaller domestic scale here, because there's a war going on, and it's not that Austen ignores that, and it, as I said before, really bothers me when people are like, oh, but why doesn't she talk about the war? She is, because if you read this when it came out, you know that there's a war going on because you're living through it. The fact that these officers are, you know, japesing for the entertainment of teenage girls when they're supposed to be there because the French might invade at any moment. But also there's this idea of, so, you know, I won't go into it too much detail, but a lot of you guys watching have probably at least read some of Vindications of the Rights of Women. And then there's this great bit, it's quite near the beginning, where Myra Wollstonecraft talks about the problem with a soldier's education. And she says that, like young women, they have been trained and raised to be silly and frivolous and to perform for attention. And she specifically talks about them joking and, you know, like japing at balls and dances and parties. This scene, if I could have an Austen conspiracy theory, it's that I think that this is a little kind of nudge, wink, wink reference to that moment in Wollstonecraft, because we are almost certain that she read that. She's got to have done. But yeah, this bit here, it just, the more I look back at it and the more I compare it side by side, it really, really closely resembles this very harsh criticism that Wollstonecraft makes about the education of soldiers. And though Austen herself wouldn't have been alive, or at least not old enough to be conscious of things like Coxheath Camp, because that was I think it's either the 7 Years' War or the French Indian War or something like that. It's kind of post empire expansion. It's something that stuck around in memory, and the militia have this issue tacked onto them. And this is a very intentional moment, and she places it. It's not something Lizzie sees, it's something that comes from Lydia's mouth as a secondary story. And I think that's really, really significant for the reader.
People need to remember too, the militia it's not like the regular army. These guys aren't going to go off to France to fight Napoleon. They buy these commissions, these officers especially, they buy these commissions so they can stay there in England. And that's why, it goes back to why Wickham joins to begin with, because he wants to hang out with the society of women in the town and enjoy himself. And this is what officers get to do.
Yeah, and this is the whole thing about the militia, and it's a part of a much bigger kind of anxiety that's happening at this time. And read my book when it comes out. But this is something that people are really worried about, because Britain really thought it needed a militia. There was a very, very strong chance that Napoleon was going to invade. And, the Napoleonic Wars were spread far. They were in Egypt, they're in Italy, they're in Spain. The Navy is far flung. Someone has to protect Britain's borders. But they're all lollygagging around. There's no, they're all kind of like either second sons or washed up noblemen, or, in some cases you might get someone who was a veteran of the 7 Years' War and is too old to go and do active service, but acts as a militia captain. But in a lot of cases, it's an excuse to put on a nice coat and to schmooze in different towns and get paid for it. And it allows men like Wickham to get away with it. And I said this, right back earlier, that the perception of the red coat erased a man's history. If they looked good in an officer's jacket, it didn't matter who they were before, because now they were a soldier, but they weren't really a soldier. They were, a guy who would probably never, probably didn't know which way the bayonet actually went, but was very good at dancing. And it was a bit of a propaganda campaign. If you've got all these handsome officers, most militiamen were over 6 foot, they picked them specifically. Henry Austen was a militiaman for this exact reason, because he was handsome and he was tall and he was very charming. Send them into towns across the UK, particularly in the south of England, and everybody's like, wow, we love the army. The army's great. And it keeps that positive kind of, propaganda thing going. Mm-hmm. But it also means men like Wickham get away with a lot of things. Yeah. And there's a real anxiety about the dissipation and the kind of decadence and so on and so forth.
I wonder if Austen's, one more thing. I wonder if this isn't Austen's kind of way here too. Because we get Navy in her novels, and her brothers are Navy, and there's good impressions of Navy, and now, but she's describing the army and the militia like this is what these people do. Like, she's a Navy girl, so you get that in the letters. She loved her brother Henry. They were very, very close. That is evidently clear. When he joins the militia, she is not impressed. And you get this real sense in the letters that she's quite critical of him. Yeah. And there's been suggestions that Wickham is a bit of a teasing caricature to a certain extent, which I don't think is fully true, but there's definitely a stark contrast. And this is something that I talk about quite a lot. There's a definite difference between the way the militia is presented and the way the Navy is presented. That's the next novel, Mansfield Park, we get Navy. So, yeah.
Yeah.
All righty. They are, so then they go home. It's home again, jiggity jig. They arrive there. Mr. Bennet especially is very happy. I'm glad you are come back, Lizzie. More than once during the dinner, he would voluntarily say to Elizabeth, I'm glad you are come back, Lizzie. She's his favorite. And they have a party, all the Lucases are there. And then this one I reminded, came to meet Mariah and hear the name. I'm like, oh, that's right. She was with him the whole time. And I just get, and we see how impressionable she was during the whole trip to Rosings, and how impressionable she was, everything that was going on. And I can imagine her in the company of 4 of the Bennet sisters here, but especially with Lydia and Kitty, really kind of, they're also shaping her. This is how you should look at the world. And nobody pays attention. She's like, doesn't matter. We get a little more on this kind of information here that they all get together and then they talk about. But I thought this was fascinating that Lady Lucas was inquiring of Mariah across the table after the welfare and poultry of her eldest daughter, which is another wink, because in the last chapter we had this, which I didn't read as snide at the time, and Kathleen pointed it out to me, that Elizabeth says, talks about, or the narrator, her home, about Charlotte, her home and her housekeeping, her parish and her poultry, and all her dependent concerns had not yet lost their charms. That there's a little dig in there, Charlotte's life is about her parish and her poultry. That's not that important, but it's important to Charlotte, of course. And of course, right away, this is what her mother's asking about. So,
and it's one of those interesting kind of we talked about this, I think the last time I was on, about the choice that she's made and why does she make that choice. And there is a genuineness in Lady Lucas that's kind of she has a parish, she has poultry, they're almost proud of her, and it is quite a sweet family. They all come out to meet Mariah. There's an interesting other version of this novel that is all from the Lucas's perspective.
Oh, I wonder if that's out there. I'm sure it is. I'm sure
somebody's written
let
us know if someone's written novel. This. Or a Mariah novel.
There you go. Mrs. Bennet just wants to hear about the London fashions. Kitty's or Lydia's telling Mary she should have gone, because they would have treated her to a lunch too if she had gone. And she's like, oh, we talked and laughed. Well, Lydia talked and laughed. Mary, of course, prefers, I should infinitely prefer a book, Mary says, which for readers, and we're all readers, that's why we love these books and we do this, we think like, yeah, but Mary should not be just preferring a book. She should be out there in the world. So it goes back to that Elizabeth defending. It's like, I'm not a great reader. I just like to read sometimes. It's not a big deal.
Well, Mary's like the flip side of the coin to Marianne, and in Sensibility, to Marianne Dashwood, and to Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey. These are all young women who have read too many books.
Mm-hmm.
And in all of those cases of varying, totally different degrees, because they put so much stock in books, they have no real life experience.
Yeah.
And they judge too much off of what they've read in books. And there's that kind of like, it's quite, it is a satire, because Austen's like, oh yeah, I know I'm writing a book and you're reading the book, but also don't read too many books. But the joke is not, don't read too many books, but don't forget why people write these books. They write these books because there are all these experiences, and you have to go out and live them. You've seen what happens to people.
Poor Mary. Catherine Morland's reading Gothic novels, and
I know,
Mary
she's
Ann's reading
Fordyce's
poetry, and she's reading Fordyce's sermons. It's like, oh, come on. There's a much better way to ruin your life than that. A much more.
If there's any consolation, everybody, Fordyce's sermons it's not called Sermons for Young Men, but the young men version is just as abhorrent as the young women version.
Elizabeth dreads seeing Wickham now that she knows the truth about him. She dreaded seeing Wickham again. Of course, now that she knows he's a liar and he tried to seduce, Darcy's sister, she knows this information. She just doesn't want to see him again, but she knows she's going to have to, because the officers are still here. Next chapter, chapter 40. Elizabeth is going to tell Jane everything about Darcy and Wickham, but not Bingley. She is that she's not going to reveal the information that Bingley, didn't, that Bingley was actually in love with her. She's not going to reveal that yet, and was prevented from seeing her.
Yeah, I do love the line that Jane has when after, the first thing she says after the narration says, they've just had this conversation, is like, his being so sure of succeeding was wrong, said she, and certainly ought not to have appeared, but consider how much it must increase his disappointment.
Yeah.
That even Jane is like, oh, dude, bad move. Like, why were you so convinced? Like, that's really arrogant. Why were you so convinced that you would succeed? But also is able to be like, oh my God, how heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Like, that must have been such a terrible, heartbreak. And you have kind of got that idea up until now, and you, the reader, are aware of that, as Lizzie is aware of it. But to be reminded that a man can be so disappointed, can be so, let down, and that it's also reflecting back on Lizzie and her own realization of her own vanity and arrogance, that is something to feel sorry for somebody for, that just because they've acted poorly doesn't mean that they're not worthy of sympathy. And obviously then Lizzie responds like, I am heartily sorry for him. And then her first instant response is to say to Jane, do you blame me? Like, do you think badly of me for refusing him? Like, are you mad at me? And then, do you blame me for her speaking so warmly of Wickham? It's this kind of, we've talked about this before, that she's always thinking of Darcy in this way that she's not fully conscious of. And Jane speaks about Darcy, she speaks about Darcy, and then she instantly talks about herself. And it's that intimate connection between these two people, not only as a growing love interest, but as two very similar, quite kindred spirits. And Jane in this situation is kind of like the adjudicator, the kind of bearer of the good sense, and it's that kind of, yeah, so it's just a really sweet moment between two sisters, but I think it shows again that connection between Lizzie and Darcy as two very similar people.
And Jane's also upset knowing now that Wickham is an utter villain, and
He's a cad.
And Elizabeth's like, whoa, wait, you have to choose. You can't, like, because then she's like, oh, poor Wickham. Like, you can't. It's either he's a bad guy or a good guy. Now, clearly there are gray areas, but Elizabeth's not, but not in these particular instances that they're talking about. What Wickham has done is wrong, and what Darcy did was right. And not the proposal, but about Wickham, and not about Bingley. But he was right in a way, like he didn't believe that Jane was in love with him. So, and the way the family behaved, well, he certainly can't put Bingley in that. So, he had a point. May not have been right, but he had a point. Jane mentions how there's but Wickham looks so good. The expression of goodness in his countenance, like how could he be a bad guy? And then Elizabeth has this great comment here. There certainly was some great mismanagement in the education of these two young men. One has got all the goodness, and the other all the appearance of it, which is Elizabeth getting back to being her witty, fun self again. A line like that, but also recognizing that it's how they were both educated that has led them to this moment, and that it's not a special, well, no, with either one of them, that it's not necessarily their character, who they are, who they can be.
Yeah, and it's another one of those subtle critiques of the system that this polite society can produce the perfect gentleman in Mr. Darcy, who lacks the qualities of politeness and charm and sociability, and then produce the perfect social gentleman in Wickham, who lacks decency and morality and fortitude and goodness, all of those things. And that this class system, this focus on things like appearance and charm, and this idea of responsibility and X, Y, and Z, it is not a good education. And we know that these two have gone through the same education system. Yes, they're very starkly different. One's the son of a servant, essentially, of the other one's father, but they've been schooled together. They have received the same education, and yet they have been produced so massively differently. And it really challenges this idea that had started to come to the foreground, particularly to do with things like a military education, that a certain type of education was always bound to produce a good gentleman and a good man. And this vast difference in Darcy and Wickham just proves that it's not possible, and it's not sustainable. And that if you focus too much on politeness and charm, you'll lose the morality and the stoicism. And if you focus too much on respect and admiration and being mindful of your position and all the things that Darcy values, it's going to make you come across proud and ignorant and arrogant in a way that is not pleasant in society. And Lizzie just kind of captures that in this little witty kind of aside to Jane.
She goes on a little bit after that about how her and yet I meant to be uncommonly clever. I want you to read that little paragraph. This is fascinating, I think, about what she's learned about herself.
And yet I meant to be uncommonly clever in taking so decided a dislike to him without any reason. It is such a spur to one's genius, such an opening for wit to have a dislike of that kind. One may be continually abusive without saying anything just, but one cannot be always laughing at a man without now and then stumbling on something witty.
That her, that this kind of, like her father, Elizabeth wants to be clever and witty and poke fun of everyone's foibles and how fun this was to do with Darcy, but it's led her to misread and not understand.
Yeah. And again, it's like when you're a fresher at university and you, particularly I think for women and young women, when you're trying to kind of like set yourself apart and prove yourself, a lot of young women will go through a phase of, I don't want to say arbitrarily because that's a bit dismissive, but picking something to dislike because it allows them to exercise that wit and that, sharpness, but that often isn't really founded and they don't really believe it, and they'll often go back on themselves. And I say this from, an own personal experience. And again, I think it's one of those things about the Bennet girls that makes them so relatable on so many levels, because here's this man that everybody is taking a dislike to eventually, but is supposedly so admired because he's so rich and he's so handsome and he's so well bred, and she's like, I'm going to dislike you because I can, because it helps me stand out, because I can find all these funny things to say about you. And then when she really addresses it, it all kind of falls apart. And I think, again, you can translate this into any setting, any period, be it Bollywood or a university, and it works because it is a thing that so many women in their teens and 20s go through.
And Elizabeth, well, she also mentions it's a natural consequence of the prejudices I have been encouraging. I mean, for her to use that word again, I mean, I know it's in the title, but it's something that she keeps becoming aware of, that it is something that she has been guilty of. And then she talks about a little bit about the general prejudice against Mr. Darcy, about what people think of him. And then there's that whole question there that she asked, her and Jane debate, like, should they expose Wickham? Elizabeth doesn't think they can because Darcy didn't say she could. And Jane thinks that it'll ruin him forever if they expose him. Now he'll really turn bad if everybody, knows this about him. And it's just a question for the novel too. I think when readers, like, especially encounter this, that I think it's a fair question to ask. Should she reveal what's going on with Wickham? Does her reason make sense? That because other people think so badly of Darcy that they're not going to believe it anyway, but also Darcy, I guess, because he hasn't authorized it.
Yeah. There's the other thing as well that they're not saying, but I think that they are both cognizant of, that Georgiana's also at stake here.
Yeah.
That there is a young woman who is not really out in society, who is the kind of fodder here. And I think what this novel does really well at bringing to the forefront that she plays within Sense and Sensibility is later when, Wickham commits his final deadly deed, shall we say, you realize that it is this sort of like almost the Sophie's Choice moment, that if they reveal Wickham and potentially save a future young woman and her reputation, they're doing so at the expense of Georgiana's. And it's that kind of like acknowledgement that this system is so heavily prejudiced against women, that to reveal that this full-grown man attempted to essentially kidnap and misuse this underage girl without proper chaperone, not out yet in society, Georgiana would be the one that would suffer. Wickham, yes, would suffer to an extent, but there's no social or legal protection for this young woman. Her life would be over before it even began. And it's almost like it's so horrible and so terrible that they're not talking about it, because it's unspoken between women. And even later, when things start to unfold with Lydia, they never actually say what it is they're really afraid of, but it's implicit between them, particularly as women, particularly as sisters. And I think this, she calls it the tumult of Elizabeth's mind. There's so many moving parts here. And ultimately, they're not going to do it, not just because they don't think people would believe them, or, it might make things worse, but because they're not going to throw this young woman into ruin and into kind of a state of almost no return before she's even started.
Even though she hasn't done anything, it's like she didn't run away with it. Like nothing happened, but the idea that something could have happened damages her reputation. Right,
and nothing about it would save her. It doesn't matter that she's a Darcy. It doesn't matter that she was so young. She'd be ruined. And I think, in Sense and Sensibility, you have the women that we learn, Willoughby has ruined. And we get them as this sort of Brandon's ward, kind of like this horrible potential of doppelgangerness almost. And I don't mean horrible in that she's horrible, her situation is horrible, of what could happen to Marianne. And it's the same thing. They don't reveal Willoughby, even though they can see that he's interested in Marianne, because it would further ruin this poor young woman. But also because there's this bias and prejudice towards young men. Well, he's got to marry somebody. So, the reformed rake is such a big thing at this time. Pamela has so much to answer for. There is still this romantic idea that the right woman will tame the rake and everything will be hunky-dory and he'll go back to being a good gentleman. It's not realistic, let's be honest.
Richardson tries to correct it in Clarissa by having, Lovelace being so horrible, but everybody loves Lovelace anyway.
Everybody loves Lovelace anyway. I mean, it doesn't help that he spends 1,000 pages reinforcing the same thing, and by the time Lovelace actually turns up, everyone's just so excited that he's in the novel.
I say this for Richardson Mondays, so
oh god.
Which I would do if I could, but I won't. Anyway, all right, well, we have to get to the end of this chapter so we can do the last one. The Mrs. Bennet's upset, but her comfort is that Bingley never saw Jane, but her comfort is, I am sure Jane will die of a broken heart, and then he will be sorry for what he has done. That'll another funny line from her. And then equally funny line that, but as Elizabeth could not receive comfort from any such expectation, she made no answer. I love this kind of ridiculous statement that's funny with this very dry, witty statement from Austen after it. Chapter 41, we have to get two things in here. Number one, all about, Lydia going to go away to Brighton and what Elizabeth tells her father, but then also her finally seeing Wickham. So the militia's going to leave. All the ladies are dejected except for Elizabeth and Jane. They're like, good, get out of here.
Thank
God. Elizabeth is, constantly, but because of her family's behavior, she's constantly reminded of her family's, behavior and how he's kind of right about how they behave. The sense of pleasure was lost in shame. This is about Elizabeth. She felt anew the justice of Mr. Darcy's objections, and never had she before been so much disposed to pardon his interference in the views of his friend. I mean, she could see his point. Like with a mother and sisters that behave like they do, no wonder you wanted to save Bingley from being married to Jane.
Yeah. And this line that she gives when she's talking to Mr. Bennet about Lydia, I think, what I was saying earlier about her potential.
Well, let's get to that. We find out that Mrs. Forster, who is very young, married to Colonel Forster, has invited Lydia to come because they become good friends. Kitty's left out, and she's devastated.
Poor Kitty.
And then and then her father's like, sure. And Elizabeth goes in to try to convince her father to not let Lydia go, kind of without revealing things that have happened and things that have been said, Like, I can't say
Yeah.
that Darcy proposed to me but Darcy broke up Jane and Bingley because of us. But she's got to kind of present it as Lydia is behaving horribly and it's going to affect all of us.
And the thing is, so she says, her character will be fixed and she will, at 16, be the most determined flirt that ever made herself and her family ridiculous. That line is, like I was saying about like Lydia's potential and she's so young. The thing that starts to become more obvious is as I read this novel more and more and kind of think of it more and more in light of, my research, is she shouldn't need to persuade him based on any of the information she now knows. Because to let a 16-year-old go to Brighton, aka the pleasure palace, aka the center of dissipation and vice, the Prince Regent literally went, I want a place where I can eat and cavort and, have affairs as much as I desire, and I'm going to build myself an entire palace. I mean, it's a pavilion, but it's a palace. It's literally a pleasure palace. It's very Marquis de Sade. Brighton is, it's not Bath, it's not London, where there's, at this point in time, Brighton is like sending a 16-year-old unsupervised to Las Vegas and being like, this will be fine. She should not need, and she does not need to tell him any of the stuff that she now knows, because the fact that he is willing to let his 16-year-old daughter go to Brighton in the company of a militia regiment, her and this is where the married woman chaperone thing becomes an issue. It's technically fine because she is Mrs. Forster's guest. She is the guest of a married woman. It's technically no different than Jane going to visit the Gardeners. It's no different than Catherine Morland going to Bath with the Allens. But this isn't an older married couple who can chaperone and educate a young woman, which was the idea of these things. This is like a 19-year-old girl taking her 16-year-old friend to Brighton with a big group of boys on essentially a lad's holiday, because that's what's going to happen when they get there. And I think that's the thing, when he then gives her this speech and he's like, oh, don't be uneasy. Colonel Forster is a sensible man and will keep her out of any real mischief. And this is the bit that gets me. And she is luckily too poor to be an object of prey to anybody.
How naive is he to think that that's the only danger? I mean,
because being too poor makes you also an easy target.
But he also, I wonder if it's also just, as a character of him not thinking, well, he married Mrs. Bennet, who was probably a lot like Lydia. And so she never got in any trouble. She wound up marrying a guy like me. I mean, is it that kind of, well, it's not just that kind of blindness, because then he later says that, like, oh, Lydia will be out of the house. My God, I got some peace and quiet. I think he just wants Lydia out of the house. That's what he wants. But
it's easier to let her go because she'll be a pain if she doesn't get to go. But I think there is an element that, Lizzie's pride comes from her father to a certain extent. He's also not a very wise person. He married Mrs. Bennet because he was lusting after her and then has regretted it for however many years. He, wasn't sensible enough to realize after one or two daughters that he still had daughters and should probably make provision for not having a son to be heir, but instead just had 3 more daughters and is now in a bad situation. As much as I love Mr. Bennet as a character, he is not a wise person and he is not a good father. And this speech that he gives to Elizabeth about Lydia, but also about the officers, when he's like, oh, they'll find better women, but better women won't be taken in by them in the same, Lydia is a plaything to them. She's not of enough consequence. She's not rich enough for them to suffer if they essentially abuse her.
Yeah.
They can do as they please with her, and they'll not have to suffer for it. And really, that's what Lizzie's saying. She doesn't actually need that evidence. It should be obvious. And it is almost sad. It all kind of works out in the end, but does it really? Lydia is this young girl with great potential, and she's kind of a tragedy.
He says, she cannot grow many degrees worse without authorizing us to lock her up for the rest of her life. And then, meaning that's the only way we could stop her, is we just lock her up. And then Elizabeth says, it was not in her nature, however, to oh no, not there. She says, that Lydia isn't going to change. There's nothing they can do about it. And that's the question I have. Well, what could they do anyway? Yes, he could just say you can't go, but are they really ever going to change her behavior at this point? Are they ever going to change the way she sees the world with what she's had so far?
The answer is no, because they are not going there. I don't believe, and I don't think Austen believes, that Lydia is a character that is at this point unsalvageable. I think Elizabeth's point when she says, her character will be fixed at 16 is that she is savable. She is, she is 16. She is a child. She is a girl. And the idea, of course, at this time, and that you kind of get in those scenes with Lady Catherine, is that education can do a lot for a person. The problem is the standards of education are not great, and what's fashionable in education is not necessarily producing good people. But there's very much this idea that I think Austen does, to an extent, subscribe to, that good company can change a person. You really see this at the end of Sense and Sensibility with Marianne, that the relationship with Colonel Brandon, we don't see it as being that romantic at the end of the text, but there's this idea that she'll flourish in his company because he's actually a lot like her. He's actually secretly a very passionate person, but he's learned how to control it and how to express it in a good way. And there's this idea that she'll come to do the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like if Lydia was, if there was another aunt or another uncle or a cousin that she could be sent to, or a school that they trusted, a school that they knew that was decent, a good finishing school, that maybe, she's always going to be Lydia. They're not going to transform her, but there is this kind of idea that the poor girl has been so, terribly molded by the neglect and indulgence simultaneously of her parents, that she is beyond saving because they're not going to do anything. And I guess this is the satire / tragedy, is that in a different version where Colonel Forster turns up with a wife who is, more like Admiral Croft's wife, where she's a military wife, she knows what it's like, she's gone through this very, not necessarily a hard life, but a life where she's very conscious of things. And Lydia maybe could have flourished with Mrs. Forster, but Mrs. Forster is a 19-year-old flirt who saw a way to set herself up with this idiot bumbling colonel. So this is not the educational trip of the heroine of Sensibility. This is like a weird, perverted version of that. I think it's very intentionally kind of mimicking and satirizing some of the plots of the Sensibility novels where that does happen, and a countryside girl is turned into the belle of society. It's
fascinating how this ends up, though. So I wish we could talk about that now, and how Lydia does, in a sense, kind of.
Yeah, it kind of does happen.
So, in a bizarre way. All righty. Because Lydia would not be able to see Brighton as anything other than a paradise. That's what it is for her. There's nobody going to change her mind about that. And she's going to have to go, according to Mr. Bennet. Anyway, Elizabeth was now to see Mr. Wickham for the last time, having been frequently in company with him since her return. What? we didn't get to see, like, that had to be a cut. That had to be a cut scene that Austen had written. Like, clearly there was a scene with them first together where something awkward occurs, but because that's really surprising that they've been seeing each other, I guess, frequently. And
yeah, there is also that thing of like the way that these social engagements work out. It is very possible that she's managed to avoid him up until this point.
That's hard. I mean, it is hard. Yeah. He beelines for her. He wants to talk to her. He's not got Miss King to pay attention to now. And she but she's no longer impressed by his attentions. She had learned to detect. We talked to Stephanie Barron. Jane Austen mentions that detect is 2 times, I think, in this chapter. She'd even learned to detect in the very gentleness which had first delighted her, an affectation and a sameness to disgust and weary. Now she's seeing how she's no longer impressed. It's like her eyes are open now.
The rose-tinted glasses are off.
And it's not all about, and as she thinks, it's not all about her vanity of like, oh, he's paying attention to me and isn't this great?
Well, she becomes really hyper-aware in this moment that he's a performance.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that's key to the rake. You know, the whole thing about the rake is it's a performed hypermasculinity, and it's a performance of gender and a performance of something. And obviously he's kind of not a rake because he charms women. He's like a rake and a fop all rolled into one, which is the more realistic. This actually, quite often rakes were very close to fops because they're both.
She calls it idle and frivolous gallantry.
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing, like it is foppishness and rakishness because it's performed. And the thing about those performances is they're designed to be charming and pleasing to women in 2 very different ways, but they're designed to please and charm women. And it's like that moment where she's seen behind the curtain and she's seen the performance and that it's not just for her and that it's not genuine. And once she's aware of that, how trite and contrived and really without brilliance or genius his performance of politeness is, because it becomes obvious it's not politeness, it's foppishness, it's rakishness, it's this, bargain basement Marquis de Sade kind of like character that he, starts to become.
But he's good at it. And that's why she was taken to begin with. And she realized there's 2 other men who also approached her, Mr. Collins and Darcy, and thought like, she'll of course, succumb to this. And she didn't. But with Wickham, she did. And now she says, because she could not but feel the reproof contained in Wickham's believing that however long and for whatever cause his attentions had been withdrawn, that he had stopped flirting with her vanity would be gratified and her preference secured at any time by their renewal. That's exactly what she went through with Darcy. Like, she can't believe that he thought she would like him and say yes. And it's the men's perception of the response they're going to get. She's finally realized that that's going on here, like big time. And
and she's a country girl at the end of the day. Like, this is not something, if she was part of the court or in London, probably something she'd have come across quite often and that somebody might have warned her about. It's not something a country girl's coming across every day.
Well, she finally mentions Darcy and Fitzwilliam to him, test him out here. She mentioned Colonel Fitzwilliam's and Mr. Darcy's, having both spent 3 weeks at Rosings. He looked surprised, displeased, alarmed, but with a moment's recollection and a returning smile, replied. Like, first he's like, uh-oh. And then he's trying to, he doesn't just try to turn the charm on again. He asks questions to like get information, like, well, what did you find out about them or me? Me is what he wants, right? And her response is that I think Mr. Darcy improves on acquaintance. So vague. So she's really toying with him through this that I love.
And like, he's kind of having that moment, when it says like Wickham's alarm now appeared in heightened complexion and agitated look, because he knows what he's done.
Yep.
But he is kind of like, Darcy will not have told Elizabeth what I've done. He might have told her something. And, he has that silence. And then he turns her to again in the gentlest of accents and gives this very smooth, very smarmy attempt to win her back over. And you have that realization that he really thinks that he will always get away with this because he thinks he has Darcy essentially in like a blackmail situation. If you ever reveal me, your sister's ruined. And I know that the only thing that's really important to you is her. So I'm scot-free because you're never going to tell anybody. And then this whole speech about his pride and the jab about Mr. Burr.
Yeah.
Even though Elizabeth is like, yeah, that is funny because she's seen Lady Catherine and she knows that that's, somewhat genuine. You then get that bit where it's like possibly a mutual desire of never meeting again. Because her response to that does not win her back. And I don't think he thinks that she knows, but he's realized that she knows enough and she's seen enough, and he's instantly like, right, this is done.
Yeah.
This is not safe anymore. I know where my boundaries are. I know when, the game is lost, on to the next game. And I think just that little bit of like possibly a mutual desire.
He tries to give this little like, oh, of course Darcy looked okay excuse because he was at Rose's and then about Mr. Berg, and then it's Elizabeth could not repress a smile at this, but she answered only by a slight inclination of the head. I mean, this is her being arch again, as she always was with Darcy that he loved so much.
And it reminds you that earlier in the novel, he avoided Darcy. He didn't go to the ball. And when we're reading, when we read it for the first time, we're like, oh, well, of course, because Darcy was awful to him and poor Wickham, because that's what Lizzie thinks. Then we realize when, that he's maybe never going to want to see Elizabeth again, that it's like once he realizes that somebody might uncover him or put this performance at jeopardy, he avoids them because it's easier to keep the performance up by just avoiding those people. And because of the way that he's constructed his lie, he can do that. It works. People believe it. And I think, on a reread, you start to see the constructed narrative that Wickham creates and the way that he's performing it, and you realize how much he's masterminded this situation to get away with everything.
And we realize that along with Elizabeth is fascinating, which I think is one of the brilliant things that Austen does here. The reader is in Elizabeth's place. And that's just last time when she read the letter. She read a letter that revealed everything, that changed her perception of everything, just as the reader was reading.
We read it along with her.
Reading along with her.
It's such a clever way of creating narrative because it's not first person, but we're placed so closely with Elizabeth that it works better than first person because we don't think about how fallible she is. We let ourselves be drawn along with this charming, witty young woman, forgetting that actually she's quite inexperienced and she's prideful, and we are just as shocked and taken in. And it makes it work. This is still, to an extent, a didactic novel. It's not didactic in the way that a Richardson or a Fordyce is, but it's didactic in the way that Gothic is. It's trying to convey something to the reader, and you feel that same embarrassment and shame at being taken in that Lizzie feels. And I think that's such a powerful learning experience. You're not shamed for it either. There's no like harshness to it. It's just like, okay, honey, you've learned your lesson. Now what happens? And that's what Austen always does. The same thing happens in Emma and in Northanger, but it's really powerful the way she does it with Lizzie.
Well, as you said, they parted at last with mutual civility and possibly a mutual desire of never meeting again, that her flirtation with Wickham is over and he realizes it too. And now Lydia is off to Brighton.
Without a care in the world.
What's Brighton like now? Is it still the pleasure palace of sin that it was?
I mean, it depends how conservative you are.
Okay. It can be if you want it to be,
fantastic.
maybe.
Brighton's fantastic. It's very arty. It's very like forward thinking. The pavilion, to be fair to the Prince Regent, one of my many historical nemeses, it is beautiful. It's really, really beautiful. I will give him that. It's really nice. But yeah, Brighton is fantastic. It's I'm from like the Midlands, so I spent all my childhood going to like the northern seaside towns, which are so very different. The first time I went to Brighton, I was like mind blown. I was like, what? Seaside towns are this nice? But yeah, it's fantastic. If you guys are ever over in the UK and over that side, heading down to Brighton is lovely. It's got a great LGBTQ scene. There's great food, awesome antique shops, and like creators. Yeah, like I think it's maybe like one of the few good things the Prince Regent did was make Brighton this kind of like vibrant party.
He didn't mean for it to be, but it turned out
yeah.
well.
I will not give him the credit, but
all righty. Well, Jane-ites, thank you all for tuning in today. Thanks to our show sponsor, Lisa Washington. Thanks to all of you who have donated or joined as members over the last week and since the beginning of the show. Your support helps us bring the show to everyone, create other one-of-a-kind programs and courses, and also helps us care for our collections at the Rosenbach. And I want to thank Rebecca R. of Philadelphia. Last week, I thanked Rebecca for joining as a member, but she also made an accompanying donation. So there you go. Rebecca, you get 2 thank yous. Thank you. Many of you also joined as members. At Rosenbach membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to member-only events. It really is true that this show wouldn't exist without your support. So thank you all. Remember, we have an Austen Mondays Facebook group where you can look us up and continue the conversation on this video that you're watching now. If you haven't already done so, like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave comments there as well. That kind of stuff really helps us gain more visibility on YouTube and helps us grow our audience. Thanks to Brianna, who was our chat Mrs. Reynolds, for managing the links in our chat. Thanks to Stephanie Barron for taking a turn about the room with us today. Did you get to listen to that, Lauren?
Yes, I did. It was brilliant. So
Good.
Interesting hearing her perspective.
Completely fascinating. I want a whole hour or more to talk about everything. Join us on our next episode, everyone, when author Collins Hemingway will take a turn about the room with me. And Dr. Kathleen Hudson will join me as chapter annotation co-host for chapters 42 and 43. Only 2 chapters. To be mistress of Pemberley might be something. Elizabeth visits Pemberley and Darcy takes a swim, right? That happens?
Yeah, that happens. And it's Chatsworth.
Yes, I'm going to read that in this right now. Thank you, Lauren. This is always great talking to you. I love having you.
Thank you so much for having me. And if y'all aren't already sick of me, then you can find me over on the Ghoul Guides, either on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, or Google Play.
Yeah, watch those and like and subscribe to all that stuff too.
Yes, please.
Totally wonderful. Thank you, Lauren. Thanks to Tucker Christine, who wrote in our opening and closing credits music. Thanks to my daughter, Lulu, who shot and created the credits with me. Farewell, readers. If you're ever in Brighton, say hi to Lydia. Alrighty. Bye-bye.